They spent $2.3 million building a pipeline through my ranch while I slept, then told me I should thank them. Monday morning, I step outside to see the HOA president in her spotless white Tesla, directing bulldozers as they hook her neighborhood straight to my family's natural spring. No notice, no permits, no permission, pure theft. She pointed at my great-grandfather's hand-built fence posts, the ones that survived the Great Depression and 80 brutal Montana winters, and told the crew, just work around those obstacles. 4 hours later, those posts were bulldozed into splinters. That's when I decided someone was getting a crash course in water rights law. What would you do? Let them steal your family legacy? Comment where you're watching from. I bet your HOA horror story doesn't end like mine did. You won't believe how fast that Tesla Karen panicked when the proof hit the table. Let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started, because nobody wakes up one day and decides to steal a neighbor's water without some serious backstory. And trust me, this backstory is a doozy. My name's Ezra Blackwood. I'm 54, third generation on this 47-acre spread in Montana that my grandfather claimed during the Depression. Lost my wife Sarah about 18 months ago to cancer, and I'll be honest, the ranch feels too big and too quiet without her laugh echoing off these mountains. Used to be a civil engineer before I retired early to spend Sarah's final years holding her hand instead of holding meetings. The real treasure on this property isn't the house or the cattle. It's the natural spring bubbling up near the old oak grove, crystal clear water that's been feeding Clearwater Creek since before Montana was even a state. 2,400 gallons a day, every single day. My grandfather used to say that spring water could cure anything except stupidity. Turns out he was only half right. About 3 years ago, this development called Windridge Heights sprouted up next to my property like an expensive rash. 87 luxury homes, each running $800,000 to $1.2 million. You know the type, lawns so perfect they look fake, 3-car garages, and HOA rules longer than the Constitution. Enter Madison Hartwell, 48 years old, former corporate lawyer from Seattle, who moved here and immediately got herself elected HOA president. This woman drives a white Tesla with vanity plates reading Rules 1 Est and introduces herself like she's running for Supreme Court Justice. Madison Hartwell, president of the Windridge Heights Homeowners Association, committed to maintaining community standards and property values. She's got this particular shade of blonde that costs more than most people's mortgage payments and speaks in a tone that suggests everyone around her is slightly disappointing. Her perfume is so aggressively floral it could wilt actual flowers. Madison has never met a regulation she didn't want to enforce or a conversation she couldn't turn into a lecture about community responsibility. Here's where our paths crossed in the worst possible way. Last spring, Windridge Heights started having water pressure issues. Shocking, I know. Build 87 homes in ranch country and suddenly the municipal system can't keep up. The city quoted them $340,000 to upgrade their water infrastructure. That's when Madison discovered my spring through property records research. I'm betting she figured agricultural water rights were just quaint suggestions that didn't apply to someone as visionary as herself. She started showing up at my door with a briefcase full of official-looking documents, talking about public utility necessity and eminent domain for community water access. Complete legal fiction, but she delivered it with the confidence of someone who'd spent 20 years convincing juries that black was white. Her first offer? $15,000 as a goodwill payment for the inconvenience. Inconvenience. Like she was asking to borrow my lawnmower instead of trying to hijack my family's 80-year water source. When I politely declined and asked to see actual permits, Madison's mask slipped faster than her Tesla accelerates. The practiced smile vanished, and suddenly I was hearing about unfortunate legal consequences if I didn't see reason. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, adjusting her designer sunglasses like a threat, "I hope you understand that community water access isn't really optional in situations like this." That night I called my old engineering buddy Logan Salem, who's now an environmental lawyer down in Billings. When I described Madison's legal theories, he laughed so hard he started wheezing. "Ezra," he gasped, "that woman's either completely clueless about water law or she thinks you are. Either way, somebody's about to get a very expensive education." 3 days later, I woke up to the sound of bulldozers tearing up my fence line and Madison standing next to them like she owned the place. So there I was, Monday morning at 6 a.m., watching this woman direct heavy machinery on my property like she was conducting the world's most expensive orchestra. Madison had brought along Brad Coleman, the county inspector. A guy who looked like he'd never seen a hard day's work but had definitely seen the inside of several all-you-can-eat buffets. He was waving around a clipboard and nodding at everything Madison said like one of those bobblehead dogs people put in their car windows. The contractors were from Fairmont Construction, and here's where my engineering brain started connecting dots that Madison probably wished stayed unconnected. A quick Google search on my phone revealed Derek Fairmont as the company owner, and Derek Fairmont happened to share Madison's maiden name. So not only was she stealing my water, she was funneling HOA money to her own family at inflated rates. "Sir," the lead contractor told me, adjusting his hard hat with hands that smelled like hydraulic fluid, "the lady with the Tesla said you'd already signed off on everything. We're just following orders here." I watched them tear through fence posts that had stood since my grandfather split them by hand during the Depression. The screech of metal claws ripping through seasoned oak mixed with diesel exhaust so thick you could taste it. These weren't just fence posts. They were monuments to 80 years of family persistence, and Madison was treating them like yard waste. The sound of splintering wood hits different when it's your heritage getting destroyed. I immediately called the county courthouse, and that's where my civil engineering background came in handy. 25 years of dealing with permits taught me exactly which questions to ask and which departments actually mattered. Turns out there were absolutely no legitimate permits filed for this project. The paperwork Madison kept waving around had as much legal authority as a restaurant receipt. So I started documenting everything the way I used to document construction defects, methodically and thoroughly. Photos of every damaged fence post, time-stamped and GPS tagged. Video of contractors admitting they were just following orders from the Tesla lady. Audio recordings of every conversation, because my late wife Sarah always said, "Ezra, people lie, but recordings don't." When I filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's office, Deputy Martinez took my report but kept glancing at Brad Coleman like they were old drinking buddies. Later, I'd discover that friendship was worth exactly $3,200 in consulting fees that Madison had slipped Brad the week before. Madison showed up that afternoon with a briefcase full of intimidation tactics disguised as legal documents. She brought her tennis partner Bethany, who was supposedly a lawyer but kept checking her phone and wore tennis shoes under her business suit, a dead giveaway that she'd never actually seen the inside of a courtroom. "Mr. Blackwood," Madison announced, her heels clicking across my wooden porch like an angry woodpecker, "you're now subject to $50,000 in daily fines for obstruction of public works." The combination of her aggressive floral perfume and the lingering diesel fumes from the construction equipment created this perfect toxic cloud that somehow captured the essence of my entire situation. She slid a document across my kitchen table, the same table where Sarah and I used to plan our retirement dreams. "I need you to sign this retroactive consent agreement." Back in my engineering days, I learned that retroactive consent is like retroactive pregnancy. It's not actually how things work in the real world. Property easements require written landowner consent plus environmental review, especially for projects affecting natural waterways. You can't just bulldoze first and ask permission later, no matter how many fake lawyers you bring along. I politely declined to sign and asked Bethany for her bar number so I could verify her credentials. She suddenly remembered an urgent tennis lesson and disappeared faster than free beer at a tailgate party. Meanwhile, Madison's crew had managed to hit my main electrical line while digging. My house went dark, forcing me to fire up the generator. When I confronted the foreman about the accident, he shrugged and claimed the utility lines weren't properly marked. Funny thing about living on the same property for 54 years, you tend to know where your own electrical service runs. Madison declared this proved the project was too important to stop for minor inconveniences. Minor inconveniences like electricity, property rights, and basic human decency. That evening, I called my old buddy Logan Salem down in Billings and told him we needed to escalate this fight. I also reached out to neighboring ranchers who dealt with Madison's creative interpretations of property law before. Turns out I wasn't her first target, just her most valuable one. I installed game cameras around the property perimeter and started maintaining detailed logs of every violation, every vehicle, every lie. If Madison wanted to play legal hardball with a retired civil engineer, she was about to discover why that was a very expensive mistake. The next morning would bring bigger threats and faker authority figures. But by then, I'd be ready with something Madison hadn't counted on. Actual facts and someone who knew how to use them. Tuesday morning brought a whole new level of Madison's creativity, and by creativity, I mean her supernatural ability to twist facts until they screamed for mercy. She'd filed a formal nuisance complaint against me with the county, painting me as some kind of water-hoarding Scrooge McDuck swimming in my personal reservoir while innocent families withered away from thirst. According to her complaint, my obstruction was preventing essential infrastructure for 87 struggling families. Right, struggling families in million-dollar homes. Madison had organized an emergency HOA meeting Tuesday night where residents voted to pursue all legal options against me. What those residents didn't know was that Brad Coleman had been moonlighting as an anonymous municipal source for the local newspaper, feeding reporter Cameron Singh a steady diet of Madison's version of reality. Wednesday's paper landed on my driveway with all the subtlety of a brick through a window. Rancher blocks water access for struggling families. The article made me sound like I was personally responsible for every low-pressure shower in a 50-mile radius. The smell of fresh newsprint mixed with my morning coffee, creating the perfect bitter breakfast to match my mood. I drove straight to the newspaper office and found Cameron Singh, a guy about 30 with the eager energy of someone who actually gave a damn about getting stories right. When I showed up with a box full of documentation and property damage photos, his expression shifted from polite interest to investigative hunger. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, adjusting wire-rimmed glasses while flipping through my evidence, "are you telling me this entire project started without any legitimate permits?" I handed him copies of my courthouse research and Logan Salem's contact information. Sometimes the best weapon against a lie is an overwhelming amount of truth delivered with engineering precision. By Thursday, Madison had escalated to full-scale performance art. She organized what she called a concerned citizens protest outside my property, complete with 23 Windridge Heights residents carrying professionally printed signs that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Water is a human right, and stop hoarding public resources. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. These people lived in houses that cost more than most folks see in a lifetime, standing on a public road complaining about a rancher protecting water rights that were older than their parents. The only thing missing was a string quartet and champagne service. Local TV news showed up like flies to honey, and Madison delivered an Oscar-worthy performance about elderly residents without adequate water pressure. She positioned herself perfectly for the cameras, with her Tesla gleaming in the background and protesters arranged like backup dancers in a very expensive music video. "This is about basic human dignity," she declared, somehow managing to look both maternal and authoritative while wearing sunglasses that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. When the reporter asked for my side, I invited him onto my property for a reality check. I showed him the original 1943 deed with water rights language that was older than the state highway system, demonstrated the spring's natural flow, and mentioned that I'd been offering to sell water to the municipality at fair rates for 2 years. They'd never even bothered to return my calls. During my engineering career, I'd learned that Montana water law follows prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. My family's 1943 claim trumped any municipal dreams that came later, no matter how many people waved signs or held press conferences about it. The TV footage was perfect, protesters chanting slogans that echoed off mountain ridges while my spring bubbled peacefully in the background, like nature itself was commenting on the absurdity of the situation. Meanwhile, Logan had arrived from Billings with a briefcase full of legal ammunition and the expression of a lawyer who'd just found buried treasure. His research revealed that Fairmont Construction had 7 previous violations for unpermitted work, including 2 projects where they'd started digging before permits were even submitted. "Ezra," Logan said, spreading documents across my kitchen table like he was planning a military campaign. "This gets better. Madison purchased the lot adjacent to your spring 6 months ago through something called Mountain View Properties, LLC. The shell company revelation hit me like cold water. Madison wasn't just stealing my water. She was planning to profit from it. The pipeline route would boost her property value by an estimated $180,000, turning theft into real estate investment. But the real bombshell was what Madison had told her neighbors about project costs. She'd promised federal grants would cover everything, when the truth was each household would owe $26,400 in special assessments over 10 years. That evening, As I walked my property line listening to the crunch of gravel under my boots, Madison's crew accidentally severed my internet and phone lines. The foreman claimed the utilities were improperly marked and suggested I upgrade to more reliable service. Sarah always said coincidences were just conspiracies without enough evidence. Tonight, I was starting to collect plenty of evidence. Friday morning arrived with the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. No internet, no landline, just the sound of wind through fence posts and the distant hum of Madison's lies spreading through the county like wildfire. 3 days of digital isolation might seem like nothing to most folks, but when you're fighting a legal war against someone with the county inspector in her back pocket, losing communication feels like being cut off behind enemy lines. Every hour offline was another hour for Madison to spin her narrative without opposition. She'd used my forced silence like a weapon. While I was digitally marooned, she rammed through an emergency HOA board resolution authorizing immediate legal action against obstructionist neighbors. She also filed for a temporary restraining order against me for harassment, which took some serious brass, considering she'd been the one trespassing with bulldozers. But Madison's real masterpiece was personal. Somehow, whispers started spreading through coffee shops and church groups about how I'd become mentally unstable since Sarah's death and was hoarding community resources out of spite. Using my grief over Sarah as ammunition for her water theft felt like being punched in the stomach by someone wearing brass knuckles. Sarah had been gone 18 months, but the wound was still raw enough that Madison's lies cut deep. My wife used to say I had a good heart but a terrible poker face. She would have seen right through Madison's act and probably had some choice words about women who weaponized widowers' pain. I drove to Billings Saturday morning with 3 boxes of evidence and a growing understanding that modern warfare had nothing to do with honor. Logan spread documents across his office conference table like a general planning campaign strategy, the afternoon sun highlighting coffee stains and legal annotations that represented months of careful preparation. "Ezra," he said, adjusting his reading glasses, "Brad Coleman submitted that contamination report before he ever visited your property. That's not just fraud, that's really stupid fraud." We'd enlisted help from my neighbor Dolores Martineau, a former paralegal whose ranch bordered mine and whose hatred for bureaucratic nonsense had been refined by 40 years of reading legal fine print. While I was fighting communication blackouts, Dolores had been conducting old-fashioned detective work in courthouse basements and county archives. Her discovery would change everything. The original 1889 territorial survey that established water rights with federal authority that superseded any modern municipal claims. The document smelled like century-old leather and tasted like victory when I ran my finger along the handwritten boundaries that matched my property exactly. But Dolores's real intelligence coup came from posing as a potential homebuyer and touring Madison's house. In her basement, behind imported Italian tiles and next to a wine collection that probably cost more than my truck, sat a private well system feeding Madison's entire property. "She's not even using municipal water," Dolores reported, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd just caught the devil in church clothes. "This whole crisis is manufactured. She's stealing your water to solve a problem that doesn't exist for her personally." Sunday brought Madison's second protest, complete with catered sandwiches and professionally printed banners. 23 residents stood outside my property chanting about water rights while their leader secretly pumped crystal-clear well water into her hot tub and infinity pool. The irony was so thick you could bottle it and sell it at farmers markets. State Inspector Carla Reeves arrived that afternoon with actual scientific equipment and the kind of no-nonsense boots that suggested she'd spent years wading through environmental fraud. Her water tests would eventually prove my spring exceeded federal purity standards, while municipal water contained bacteria levels that would make a microbiologist nervous. She also issued a citation against the county for false contamination reporting, which meant Brad Coleman was about to learn that lying to state environmental agencies carried consequences his consulting fee income couldn't cover. But Logan's evening phone call delivered the bombshell that transformed our defensive battle into potential federal prosecution. Madison had applied for a $2.8 million federal rural development grant using Brad's fraudulent environmental data as supporting evidence. The ham radio static mixed with my generator's steady hum as Logan explained the stakes. If that grant went through, Madison would pocket $500,000 in the spread between actual costs and federal funding. More critically, lying to federal investigators about environmental impact was a felony carrying up to 5 years in federal prison. Federal inspectors are scheduled for Tuesday morning, Logan said through the radio static. Madison has no idea they're coming, and no idea you've got documentation of every lie she's told. As I sat on my porch that night listening to my spring bubble peacefully in the darkness, I realized Monday would determine whether Madison faced civil penalties or federal prosecution. She'd escalated from property theft to defrauding the United States government. Sarah used to say that people who lie eventually forget which version of the truth they're supposed to be telling. Tomorrow, Madison would discover the cost of that confusion. Monday morning brought the kind of discovery that makes your hands shake while holding century-old paper. Dolores had spent her weekend in the county courthouse vault, a forgotten tomb of territorial documents where most people assumed important papers went to die. The leather portfolio she found smelled like decades of Montana winters and bureaucratic neglect. But what was inside would change everything. "Ezra," she whispered, spreading the document across my kitchen table like she was handling the original Constitution. "Your grandfather was one smart son of a gun." There it was, in fountain pen ink that had faded to sepia but remained perfectly legible. Exclusive and perpetual water rights to all groundwater originating within property boundaries, including covenant against interference whereby any party disrupting natural water flow owes landowner triple damages for all documented losses. My heart started pounding like I'd just sprinted up a mountain. Triple damages. Madison's bulldozers had caused $347,000 in documented property damage to fence posts, electrical lines, and century-old oak trees. Under my grandfather's 1943 covenant, she owed me $1,041,000. The morning coffee tasted different when you realized you were holding $1 million lawsuit in your hands. But Logan had been conducting his own financial autopsy of Madison's empire, and what he'd found was even more devastating than legal liability. Her house was purchased with 97% financing. She owned basically nothing except debt and designer accessories. Every HOA construction loan was personally guaranteed using her house as collateral. "Ezra," Logan said through my makeshift communication system, his voice crackling with static and satisfaction. "She's not wealthy. She's leveraged to her eyeballs. If this pipeline project fails, she loses everything: the house, the Tesla, probably her imported Italian coffee machine." The puzzle pieces crashed together like a demolition derby. Madison's aggressive tactics weren't power moves. They were desperation plays by someone whose entire lifestyle depended on successfully stealing my water. Every threat, every fake document, every manufactured crisis was actually evidence that she knew her legal position was garbage. Dolores had also unearthed the original sin. Windridge Heights was built without adequate water rights for 87 homes. The developer had sold lots knowing the municipal system couldn't handle full capacity, then vanished to Arizona before the infrastructure problems surfaced. Madison hadn't inherited a community. She'd inherited a time bomb disguised as luxury housing. The power dynamic had flipped so completely I felt dizzy. She thought she was bullying a lonely widower who'd cave under legal pressure. Instead, she'd declared war on someone who understood both engineering documentation and the paper trail connecting her lies to federal prison. But sitting in my kitchen that afternoon, holding documents that could destroy Madison's life, I remembered something Sarah used to say during our toughest ranch years. Justice isn't about how hard you can hit back. It's about protecting what matters without becoming what you're fighting. Yet I could stop construction immediately with an injunction based on the 1943 deed, or let Madison dig deeper until federal inspectors arrived Tuesday morning. Each additional day meant more damage totals and stronger criminal evidence. She'd escalated from property theft to defrauding the federal government. She deserved consequences that matched her crimes. But 86 innocent families would suffer if their HOA president went to federal prison and took their community savings with her. Tuesday would bring Catherine Miles, a federal inspector who specialized in rural development grant fraud. I could hand her complete evidence of Madison's lies and watch federal prosecutors take over. Or I could offer Madison one last chance to end this without destroying everyone around her. As evening shadows fell across the territorial documents spread on my table, I decided to give Madison 24 hours to choose between civil bankruptcy and federal prosecution. Sometimes the strongest position is offering mercy when your opponent doesn't realize they've already lost everything. Tuesday morning felt like loading ammunition for a gunfight where the bullets were legal documents and the target was someone who'd forgotten that stealing has consequences. Marcus arrived from Billings carrying 2 briefcases that represented Madison's future in leather-bound alternatives. The first contained a settlement offer that would let her claim newly discovered environmental concerns had halted the project, a face-saving lie that would cost her actual damages but keep her out of federal prison. The second briefcase was packed with criminal complaint documents that would hand her over to FBI investigators who specialized in grant fraud and didn't care about her Tesla or her law degree. "Your choice which briefcase she gets to see," Logan said, setting both on my grandfather's pine workshop table that had survived 80 years of ranch planning and was now hosting legal warfare strategy sessions. The smell of machine oil and old wood mixed with the tension of preparing for a confrontation that could either end peacefully or explode into federal prosecution. This workshop had seen 3 generations of Blackwood men planning for the future. My grandfather designing homestead expansions, my father calculating irrigation systems, and now me documenting evidence of federal crimes. While Logan organized legal strategies, I focused on the kind of documentation that engineering school had taught me to love: automated, time-stamped, and impossible to argue with. Every day of Madison's construction had generated more evidence: soil samples showing hydraulic fluid contamination near the spring source, time-lapse photography proving environmental setbacks violations, and water flow data that measured exactly how much natural resource she was stealing. Setting up those automated monitoring systems had cost me about $400 but taught me something valuable that any property owner could use. A simple flow meter connected to a data logger creates legal evidence that courts trust more than human testimony. The computer doesn't forget, doesn't get confused under cross-examination, and doesn't care how expensive your lawyer's suit is. Dolores had been running her own intelligence operation, organizing neighboring ranchers who'd tangled with Madison's creative interpretations of property law. Her discoveries were devastating. 23 HOA families had never voted for the pipeline project because they weren't at the meeting where Madison claimed unanimous community support. More damaging, 12 families had received surprise bills for $26,000 and $1,400 each, despite Madison's promises that federal grants would cover everything. Several were already consulting bankruptcy lawyers rather than pay for infrastructure they'd never authorized. The community intelligence revealed Madison's lies required a spreadsheet that looked like a conspiracy theorist's Christmas list. Different stories to different people about financing, environmental impact, legal authority, even basic water availability facts. Keeping her contradictions straight must have been like juggling chainsaws while riding a unicycle. But our psychological strategy was pure theater. Instead of public confrontation or immediate legal action, we'd let Madison think she was winning right up until reality hit like a Montana blizzard in July. No press statements, no visible preparation, no hints about what was coming. Madison would walk into Wednesday's meeting believing she was dealing with an isolated rancher who'd been worn down by legal pressure and community opposition. She had no idea that federal investigators were already reviewing her grant application, that state environmental agencies had flagged her reports as fraudulent, or that her financial records were being subpoenaed faster than she could say eminent domain. The physical preparation felt like something Sarah would have found amusing. I converted the workshop into a secure document fortress with fireproof filing cabinets and satellite internet that Madison's construction crews couldn't accidentally sever. Multiple evidence copies were stored off-site because people facing federal prison sometimes develop sudden interests in arson. Marcus had researched victim protection programs for communities defrauded by their leaders. 86 families were victims of Madison's scheme, not accomplices, and federal assistance existed to help them recover financially from their president's criminal creativity. Our timeline proved systematic deception about project costs, environmental impact, and legal authority. Most residents had no idea their community improvement fund was actually financing a federal crime spree with premium construction markup, courtesy of Madison's brother. Wednesday evening in that workshop felt like mission control before a space launch. Evidence organized in color-coded binders, original deeds, federal violations, property damage, financial fraud. Digital copies uploaded to secure servers with law enforcement access protocols that would make NSA agents proud. Physical evidence was cataloged like museum artifacts: hydraulic fluid contaminated soil samples, fragments of century-old fence posts, electrical equipment destroyed by accidental construction, chain of custody documentation that would survive scrutiny from federal prosecutors who'd spent careers convicting people who thought they were too smart to get caught. As I sat among those territorial documents and federal crime evidence Wednesday night, I thought about Sarah's philosophy. Protecting your family meant protecting your community, because good neighbors were the only thing standing between you and people like Madison. Thursday would bring either negotiated peace or federal war, depending on whether Madison chose acknowledgement or denial when faced with overwhelming evidence of her crimes. Either way, my water was staying put, and the community would learn the expensive difference between leadership and larceny. Thursday night brought the kind of desperation that turns suburban soccer moms into federal criminals with heavy machinery and no remaining sense of self-preservation. Madison had somehow discovered that Catherine Miles was arriving Tuesday instead of next week. My guess? One of her county contacts finally realized that federal inspectors ask harder questions than local deputies who accept consulting fees. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Floodlights blazed across my property at midnight, turning my peaceful ranch into something that looked like an alien landing site run by caffeinated psychopaths. Madison's crew started working around the clock with the frantic energy of people trying to finish a bank robbery before the police arrived. Heavy machinery rumbled continuously, shaking my house so violently that dishes rattled in cabinets and century-old foundation stones worked loose from their mortar. The noise was like living inside a cement mixer operated by someone having a nervous breakdown. Sleep became impossible when your neighbor was conducting industrial warfare at 3 a.m. My ham radio setup had been picking up random cell phone conversations all week when atmospheric conditions were right, but Thursday night delivered audio gold. Around 3 a.m., static cleared just long enough for me to hear Madison's panicked voice ordering her brother to finish the main pipeline junction before Tuesday morning, no matter what we have to destroy to do it. The desperation in her voice was almost palpable through the radio static. She was willing to demolish my grandfather's handmade foundation stones if that's what it took to complete her theft before federal investigators arrived. Some things are worth more than money. But Madison had clearly never learned that lesson in whatever entitled suburb had produced her. By Friday dawn, the overnight destruction was heartbreaking. 80-year-old oak trees that had shaded my childhood lay in splintered pieces beside diesel-stained earth. My workshop's electrical service was severed again, this time by a backhoe operator who claimed he didn't see the warning flags despite working in broad daylight with floodlights. Most devastating was the damage to my grandfather's original foundation, hand-laid fieldstone that had supported our family home since 1943. Watching hydraulic equipment crack those stones felt like watching someone desecrate a cemetery, except the graves belonged to my family's history instead of their bodies. The foreman told his crew, "Speed matters more than precision. The Tesla lady already settled the damage claims anyway." That lie would cost them more than their next 10 paychecks combined. I spent Friday documenting destruction with the methodical rage of someone whose family legacy was being demolished for profit. Thermal imaging revealed structural damage to foundation walls that had stood for 8 decades. Audio recordings captured workers admitting they knew they were trespassing, but didn't care because Madison had promised legal immunity. The smell of spilled hydraulic fluid mixing with destroyed oak wood created an olfactory monument to environmental vandalism that I could taste every time the wind shifted. Deputy Martinez showed up Friday afternoon to investigate noise complaints from neighboring ranchers. His performance was Academy Award worthy. Complete shock that a municipal project would violate noise ordinances, despite the $2,800 in consulting fees Madison had paid him the previous month. Apparently, municipal authority extends wherever Madison's checkbook reaches. Her media strategy hit new peaks of manufactured desperation. Weekend television news featured her tearful performance about families facing water shortages while standing beside elderly residents who had no idea their president was stealing federal money to finance her real estate speculation. The cognitive dissonance was stunning, crying about community hardship while personally profiting from crimes that would saddle innocent families with massive debt. But Friday night's thermal footage provided the smoking gun that would end Madison's criminal career. Her crew was caught dumping hydraulic fluid directly into soil near my spring source, followed by audio of workers discussing how to clean up the contamination before anyone notices the environmental damage. Environmental crimes carry federal penalties that make grant fraud look like a parking ticket. Saturday brought the human cost of Madison's desperation. 3 families with young children forced into hotel rooms because construction noise made sleep impossible. When these families complained to the HOA board, Madison dismissed their concerns as minor inconveniences during essential infrastructure development. Minor inconveniences like displaced children and poisoned groundwater. The psychological pressure was destroying Madison's last pretense of composure. She called me at 2 a.m. Saturday, her voice thick with expensive wine and cheap desperation, alternating between threats and pathetic bargaining. "You're destroying 87 families," she sobbed into the phone. "This isn't about water rights anymore. This is about community survival." When I mentioned that federal investigators would arrive Tuesday morning with very specific questions about her grant application, the sobbing stopped instantly, and the threats resumed with remarkable clarity for someone who'd sounded drunk seconds before. Her final offer revealed complete ignorance about federal law. $150,000 cash plus guaranteed water rights buyout if I'd make the federal investigation disappear. That's when I realized Madison still thought federal crimes could be solved with private checkbooks. Sunday brought champagne celebration photos on Facebook as Madison announced pipeline completion, surrounded by grateful residents who had no idea they were toasting their own financial destruction. Monday would determine whether she chose confession or federal prosecution when confronted with evidence that could end her freedom. Monday morning arrived with the kind of false calm that precedes natural disasters, except this disaster was wearing designer heels and driving a white Tesla toward federal prosecution. Madison spent the morning posting victory lap content on social media, sharing photos of her completed community water project with captions about triumph over obstructionism and visionary leadership delivering results. The irony was so thick you could bottle it and sell it as premium stupidity. She'd invited local media for a 2 p.m. ribbon-cutting ceremony, apparently believing that public celebration would somehow make federal crimes disappear through the magic of positive publicity. What Madison didn't know was that Catherine Miles had arrived a day early for her preliminary site assessment and was already walking the pipeline route with federal authority and a very serious expression. I watched from my kitchen window as Inspector Miles examined the pipeline connection, took water samples, and documented violations with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent years putting federal criminals in prison. Every photograph she took was another nail in Madison's legal coffin. The best part? Madison was forced to proceed with her ribbon-cutting ceremony while a federal inspector documented environmental crimes happening literally in the background of her celebration photos. Local news crews captured footage of Madison giving speeches about community triumph, while Inspector Miles collected evidence of federal violations 20 feet away. The visual was perfect, manufactured celebration overlapping with authentic investigation. "This project represents what communities can accomplish when we work together toward common goals," Madison announced to the cameras, apparently forgetting that federal fraud wasn't typically considered a community goal. At 10 a.m., I sat across from Madison at my kitchen table, the same table where she'd first threatened me 6 weeks ago, and watched her world implode in real time. Marcus appeared via video call, while Dolores served as witness to what would either be confession or the final lies before federal prosecution. The morning sun highlighted coffee stains and legal documents spread between us like battlefield maps. I calmly placed the original 1943 deed on the table, pointing to the clause that established exclusive water rights and triple damages for interference. Madison's face went through interesting color changes as she realized her legal advisor had given her advice worth exactly nothing. "That's impossible," she whispered, touching the century-old paper like it might burn her fingers. "Municipal authority overrides agricultural water rights. Bethany told me agricultural claims don't apply to residential development." Marcus explained through the video connection that territorial water rights supersede all modern municipal regulations, and federal law recognizes 1943 territorial claims as superior to any subsequent local ordinances. That's when Madison's mask finally slipped completely. "You can't bankrupt 87 families over some old paperwork," she screamed, her carefully maintained composure evaporating like morning dew in August heat. "This is extortion disguised as property rights." I offered her the settlement option. Stop construction immediately, restore my property to original condition, pay actual damages instead of triple damages, and cooperate fully with federal investigators in exchange for me not filing additional criminal complaints. She had 24 hours to accept before Inspector Miles received complete documentation of her crimes. Madison rejected the offer with the kind of arrogance that comes from never facing consequences for bad decisions. She stormed out of my kitchen, declaring that her lawyers would bury me in litigation and that federal investigators wouldn't find anything actionable. And within 2 hours, she was on the phone with her brother demanding immediate acceleration of the federal grant reimbursement request. Apparently, Madison thought she could collect stolen federal money faster than federal investigators could catch federal criminals. The afternoon ribbon-cutting ceremony became a masterpiece of unintentional comedy. Madison stood beside her completed pipeline giving interviews about community leadership, while Inspector Miles documented violations in the background that would trigger FBI involvement within hours. Television footage captured Madison cutting a ceremonial ribbon while federal evidence collection proceeded literally behind her. The visual metaphor was perfect. Celebration of crimes while law enforcement documented those same crimes. By evening, the preliminary federal assessment was complete. Inspector Miles had found 14 separate violations of federal environmental law, plus evidence of fraudulent permits, contaminated waterways, and systematic deception of federal grant programs. Her phone call to FBI Financial Crimes Division happened at 6 p.m. Monday evening, officially transforming Madison's local authority power trip into federal criminal investigation. The community panic started immediately. Word spread through HOA residents that federal investigators were examining their water project, and 23 families discovered they'd never legally approved the special assessments that were financing Madison's crimes. Several residents hired independent lawyers after learning their president had put them at legal and financial risk through systematic fraud. Madison's support network collapsed faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to suspend her as president pending federal investigation outcomes. Local banks froze construction accounts when federal marshals served document preservation notices on Madison, her brother, and every county official who'd accepted her consulting fees. By 9 p.m. Monday, Madison appeared at my door visibly drunk and begging to accept the settlement offer I'd made that morning. Too late. Federal criminal investigations can't be stopped by private agreements once they've officially started. She offered everything she owned to make this federal thing go away, apparently still believing that checkbooks could solve federal felonies. Tuesday morning would bring FBI agents with search warrants and very specific questions about grant fraud, environmental crimes, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Tuesday evening brought the kind of public reckoning that transforms small-town drama into federal case study material, complete with FBI agents, television cameras, and 200 very angry residents who'd just discovered their president was a federal criminal. The emergency town hall meeting at Windridge Heights Community Center was packed beyond fire code capacity. FBI agent Sarah Salem sat in the front row with a briefcase full of evidence, and the kind of expression that suggested Madison's legal problems were about to become everyone's business. Local news crews positioned cameras to capture what would either be confession or complete meltdown, while Cameron Singh from the newspaper prepared to document the biggest story of his career. I arrived with a single manila folder containing documents that would either save Madison's remaining dignity or destroy her completely, depending on how much truth she could handle in public. The visual trap I'd prepared was simple but devastating. Large screens displayed side-by-side photographs of my spring before and after Madison's pipeline installation, showing natural water flow dropping from 20,400 to 960 gallons daily. Time-lapse video revealed the pipeline route crossing my property line by 340 feet, a trespass so obvious that even Madison's fake lawyers couldn't spin it. But the real showstopper was aerial footage of the environmental damage, combined with bank statements showing Madison had transferred $47,000 from community funds to personal accounts for administrative expenses. Madison took the podium first, launching into a performance that would have impressed Broadway audiences if they appreciated desperation disguised as righteousness. She claimed to be the victim of vindictive neighbors and federal overreach, while standing beside elderly residents she'd been systematically defrauding for months. "I've dedicated 3 years of my life to improving this community," she declared, her voice carrying just the right combination of wounded pride and manufactured patriotism. "Mr. Blackwood is using legal technicalities to harm 87 innocent families who simply want adequate water pressure." She produced letters from grateful residents, thanking her for water access, conveniently omitting that those same residents would be paying $26,000 each for the privilege of using stolen water. The crowd murmured sympathetically until I quietly approached the podium with my manila folder. I placed the original 1943 territorial deed on the overhead projector, pointing to the specific clause that had established my family's water rights 8 decades before Madison was born. This document means the pipeline was always illegal, I explained in the kind of calm voice that carries more authority than shouting, regardless of permits, municipal claims, or community need. The room fell silent as 200 people realized they'd been watching a criminal enterprise disguised as community improvement. Agent Salem stood up to explain the federal charges pending against Madison: grant fraud, conspiracy, bribery, environmental crimes, and systematic deception of federal funding programs. Potential penalties included $2.8 million in restitution, plus criminal fines, and up to 15 years in federal prison. The 87 families of Windridge Heights are victims of this scheme, Agent Salem announced, not participants. Federal victim assistance programs are available to help community members recover financially from their president's criminal activities. That's when Madison's public breakdown reached spectacular heights. She interrupted Agent Salem mid-sentence, screaming about persecution and communist government overreach, while accusing me of planning this whole setup to steal federal grant money. Security moved toward the podium as Madison's voice reached frequencies that probably violated noise ordinances. "This is harassment disguised as law enforcement," she shrieked at Agent Salem. "I'll expose the corruption in federal agencies that allows this kind of abuse." Security escorted her from the building while she shouted threats at me, federal investigators, and anyone else within earshot. The exit was captured by every camera in the room, creating footage that would probably end up in federal prosecutor training materials. With Madison removed, the truth emerged like water from a broken dam. HOA Treasurer Janet Morrison revealed the hidden financial damage. The project had cost $340,000 over budget, financed through unauthorized loans secured against community assets. Several families shared stories of questioning Madison's authority but being told to trust the process and stop obstructing community progress. Neighbor Patricia Williams admitted she'd suspected fraud months ago, but was afraid to challenge someone with legal training and political connections. The community realized they weren't participants in infrastructure improvement. They were victims of an elaborate confidence game run by someone who'd convinced them that theft was actually community service. I stood up to offer my solution. Despite my legal right to demand $1.04 million in triple damages, I proposed a legitimate water-sharing agreement. I'd sell 1,200 gallons daily at cost, providing reliable water access while preserving the natural spring ecosystem. Revenue would help families avoid bankruptcy while funding long-term environmental monitoring to protect the watershed that supported our entire region. Agent Salem announced that federal authorities would recover the $2.8 million in fraudulent grant money from Madison's assets, with recovered funds redirected to legitimate municipal infrastructure improvements managed by honest officials. The pipeline would be removed at federal expense as part of environmental restoration, returning Clearwater Creek to its natural flow patterns. Sheriff Martinez had been arrested earlier that day for accepting bribes, replaced by Deputy Rodriguez, who'd spent his career actually enforcing laws instead of selling exemptions to the highest bidder. As the meeting ended, reporter Cameron Singh asked why I hadn't pursued maximum legal damages against someone who'd caused so much harm. "Justice isn't about destroying people," I said, thinking about Sarah's philosophy of community protection. "It's about stopping harm and preventing future victims." Madison destroyed herself by choosing federal crimes over honest solutions. The final image captured by television cameras was perfect, the pipeline being disconnected from my spring source while natural water flow returned to 2,400 gallons daily, feeding Clearwater Creek for the first time in 6 weeks. The community voted unanimously to accept my water-sharing proposal and elect a new HOA board committed to transparency, legal compliance, and actual community service instead of personal enrichment disguised as public benefit. 6 months later, the transformation was so complete you'd think we were living in a different universe entirely. Madison Hartwell was serving 4 years in federal prison, plus paying $2.3 million in restitution to the communities she'd defrauded. Her brother's construction company was banned from federal contracts and had declared bankruptcy after losing their insurance bonds. Brad Coleman was completing 18 months in federal prison while permanently banned from any government employment that involved public trust. Sheriff Martinez had pleaded guilty to corruption charges and lost his law enforcement certification along with his pension, proving that selling justice eventually costs more than keeping it. The environmental recovery exceeded everyone's expectations. My spring flowed at full capacity again, feeding a healthy, Clearwater creek that supported fish populations and wildlife that had been struggling during Madison's theft period. Federal environmental teams had removed every piece of pipeline infrastructure at government expense, replanting native vegetation along the restored creek bed using specialized techniques that actually improved the ecosystem beyond its original condition. The state of Montana designated my property as a protected watershed under their conservation program, providing tax benefits while ensuring permanent protection against future development pressure. The legitimate water sharing agreement had become a model for rural-suburban cooperation throughout the region. I provided 200 gallons daily to Windridge Heights at cost-only pricing, 0.3 of a penny per gallon compared to municipal rates of 0.8 of a penny. The community saved money while receiving higher quality water than municipal systems could provide. Monthly revenue of $1,460 covered my ranch maintenance costs while funding the Sarah Blackwood Conservation Scholarship Program. The $25,000 annual awards went to environmental engineering students at the University of Montana who were studying watershed protection and sustainable water management. 3 part-time employees helped manage the educational center I'd established in my converted workshop, teaching school groups about water rights, environmental stewardship, and the importance of protecting natural resources for future generations. The sound of children learning about conservation in the same workshop where my grandfather had planned his homestead felt like the perfect continuation of family legacy. I'd become a regional consultant helping other communities resolve water rights disputes through cooperation instead of litigation, and my book, Standing Your Ground, A Rancher's Guide to Property Rights, had become required reading in several environmental law programs. The community healing process had been remarkable to witness. The new HOA board implemented transparent financial reporting with monthly meetings held in my restored workshop, where residents could see exactly how their money was being spent and vote on every significant decision. Federal victim assistance had provided average payments of $12,400 per household, helping families recover from Madison's financial fraud. 87 families now understood the difference between legitimate leadership and criminal exploitation disguised as community improvement. The broader impact reached far beyond our small corner of Montana. The state legislature passed the Hartwell Act, requiring environmental review for all HOA infrastructure projects affecting natural waterways, preventing future Madison-type schemes through mandatory oversight and public notification requirements. Federal grant programs had implemented stricter oversight procedures that made systematic fraud much harder to accomplish, and 3 other communities had contacted me about resolving their water disputes through peaceful negotiation instead of expensive litigation. Environmental law schools now used our case as a study in how property rights protection could benefit entire communities instead of just individual landowners. The monthly community meetings had become social events as much as business meetings, with residents bringing potluck dishes and children playing near the spring while adults discussed water usage reports and conservation strategies. Former adversaries had become allies in protecting regional water resources from corporate development pressure that threatened the entire watershed. My personal healing had been unexpected but profound. Working with the community to solve problems together had reduced the isolation I'd felt since Sarah's death, channeling my grief into positive action that honored her memory while protecting the land we'd both loved. The conservation trust I'd established would donate my ranch to permanent watershed protection upon my death, ensuring that future generations would have access to clean water and environmental education, regardless of development pressure or political changes. Last week brought a letter from developers planning a 200-home expansion adjacent to our watershed, claiming their environmental impact assessment showed minimal effect on regional water supply. I smiled while opening my legal filing cabinet, already prepared to defend our community again, but this time, I wouldn't be fighting alone. 87 families stood ready to support conservation over development, having learned that protecting water resources benefits everyone while stealing them benefits no one except criminals. Sometimes the best victory is turning enemies into allies while preserving what you love most.